Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to take a look at two battles you've probably never heard of. In the last episode, we covered some of the ways that advances in firearms technology through the 1800s had vastly increased infantry firepower, leaving military professionals around the world scrambling to work out how they should adapt. Here we're going to look at the British Army having to deal with this new tactical environment in the Boer War. There are a couple of points to make before we get stuck in. First of all, both of these battles took place in what is now South Africa over 100 years ago, so they are distant in time and, for me at least, distant in space. The most immediate practical effect of this is I'm pre-apologising to any South Africans out there for the upcoming pronunciation fails. Slightly less obviously, we're going to be digging into minor infantry tactics of the early Boer War, which is a niche subject inside a niche subject. It's not like there's a massive, easily accessible repository of information about this out there. A lot of what there is focuses on the broad strokes, not the fine detail, and not only are some sources a little more concerned with pushing certain viewpoints and preserving or ruining certain reputations, but they don't always agree, right down to the maps. So if you dive into this yourself, don't be too surprised if you find something that contradicts what I come out with in this video. With that out of the way, we are dealing with two battles in the opening phase of the 1899 to 1902 Second Anglo-Boer War. The Boers were Dutch settlers in South Africa who had discovered in the late 1800s that they were sitting on the world's largest supply of gold. The British, who had taken control of the original Dutch colony to secure the sea lanes to India back in the Napoleonic Wars and never gave it back, were firmly set up to the south and east of the two newly rich Boer republics, and various British interests decided that all that gold would probably be better off in their hands than the Boers. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. After some prolonged tension, including the deployment of British troops up to the border between British-held Natal and the two republics, the Boers felt threatened enough to preemptively declare war, an attempt to do what they had done in the First Anglo-Boer War 20 years earlier. Inflict a quick, decisive defeat that takes the wind out of the Brits' imperialist sails and confronts them with the possibility of a long war that would involve such expenditure of men, material and treasure that they would think again. To do this, the Boers intend to take advantage of how the British have deployed their troops. North of the Tugela River, a broad triangle of Natal projects into the two Boer republics, with the Free Orange State to the west and the Transvaal to the east. And the British have very conveniently stationed several thousand men there. To make matters worse, probably due to pressure from the governor of Natal, while the bulk of the British force is at Ladysmith, one infantry brigade with cavalry and artillery support is stationed all on its own 30 miles up the railway at Dundee. The Boers decide to fall on the isolated British elements one at a time, defeating them in detail before they can combine or fall back to much more defensible positions south of the Tugela. And the Boers are well set up to pull this kind of offensive off. The only professional arm of the two republics' military is the artillery, who need to be specialists. The rest of their force consists of mounted riflemen organised into commandos. These are essentially a militia, and while they are very loosely organised and sometimes difficult to control, they outclass the British in strategic mobility. While the British are forced to move at the pace of their marching infantry or remain tethered to the railways, the Boers have the speed and flexibility to pop up pretty much wherever they like. How the Boers intend to carry out their plan is to use their mobility to seize positions that the British can't ignore, forcing them to attack at a tactical disadvantage. And this leads to both of our two battles, Talana Hill on the 20th of October 1899 and Elandslaagte on the 21st. The detached British brigade at Dundee, under the command of Lieutenant General Penn Symons, consisting of about 4,000 men in 4 infantry battalions, 3 batteries of artillery, a squadron of hussars and some mounted infantry, finds itself waking up on the misty, drizzly morning of the 20th of October with unknown figures skylining on the crest of nearby Talana Hill. Within a few minutes, these figures are joined by 3 breech-loading Krupp guns, which start to lob shells into the British camp. These shells aren't very effective. They have percussion fuses which fail to arm in the soggy ground, but the incoming fire takes the British by surprise. By this time, the same technological developments that have revolutionised infantry small arms are starting to be felt by the artillery. The British camp is several miles away from Talana Hill. In fact, it's so far away that the British batteries have to close the range before they can engage in counterfire. So it seems likely that Symons simply wasn't expecting the enemy to have any artillery that was both powerful and modern enough to engage him at long range, while still being small and light enough to get to the top of a great big rocky hill. Undaunted, he rapidly comes up with a plan and puts it into motion. Leaving 1 infantry battalion and 1 battery to guard the camp, he orders the bulk of his guns forward to win the artillery duel and soften up the Boer infantry on the hilltop, while the rest of his infantry advances to take the enemy position. He sends the cavalry off around the flank of Talana Hill to get on the Boers' line of retreat, so that when the infantry succeed and the Boers flee, they'll be cut down. This is textbook stuff for the era. The artillery neutralises the enemy guns, the infantry storm the enemy position, the cavalry intercept the enemy's retreat and destroy them. What is questionable about the orders in this battle are that the cavalry are being sent off out of sight of the rest of the army, which is not going to end well, and that Symons' specific instructions for his infantry are tainted by broader strategic pressures. Symons knows that the Boers are out there and that they're out there in strength, but there only appears to be a detached force of about 3,000 of them up on Talana Hill. Having found a relatively small and apparently isolated force on his doorstep, Symons has resolved to crush it as fast as possible. This way it will have less chance to escape, and the other Boer forces he expects are nearby will have less time to concentrate on his force while it's busy. The result of this is that Symons orders his 3 infantry battalions to attack on a narrow front, one behind the other. He doesn't know whether he has the time to perform anything less subtle than a single hammer blow, and he doesn't know whether trying to perform more complex manoeuvres will expose his troops to as yet unseen or unarrived Boers. So he's using his infantry as a blunt instrument. The front he's ordering the attack over might be narrow, but it's not totally devoid of cover. After marching through the town of Dundee, the infantry have to cross some open ground before reaching a wood, beyond which the summit is only another 400 yards away across more open ground broken up by rocks and a stone wall. As they leave the town, the enemy artillery has already been neutralised by the Royal Artillery, and the infantry come under rifle fire from the Boers, who are mostly armed with bolt-action Mausers. The Brits take their first casualties, but these are very light, and there appears to be a few reasons for this. Firstly, the range is long. It's not immediately clear how long, but almost certainly more than 1,000 metres, at least to begin with, and the difficulties of hitting moving targets at range was probably increased by the poor weather conditions, and definitely increased by the fact that the British are wearing dull khaki uniforms against a dull background of dry grass, whilst advancing in extended open order, which would make the successive lines of British troops very difficult targets. Things change when the British reach the wood. By now they have closed the range to the point that the Boer fire is much heavier and much more effective. Casualties pick up, and the troops lose their formations as they go to ground, with all 3 battalions getting mixed up. The battle bogs down, with the Boers sitting on top of the hill blazing away at the British, who are pinned down in the wood. Penn Symons is not happy with this loss of momentum, presumably because of his strategic anxieties, and gets himself to the front to personally get things moving again. Unfortunately for him, he does this on horseback with an orderly carrying a red pennant in tow, and would struggle to look like a more important target if he tried. He's quickly hit in the stomach and evacuated, playing no more part in the battle or the campaign, and dying 3 days later in Boer captivity. From here on out, if it wasn't already, the battle is without an overall controlling hand. The British infantry battalions in the wood are all jumbled up, and it looks like command and control has fragmented, with officers leading whatever local groups of men they can exert an influence over in the chaos of all the incoming rifle fire. Nevertheless, in combination with one of the Royal Artillery batteries, which has closed the range to 1400 yards and started pouring shrapnel shells onto the Boer positions, the infantry start to trickle up the hill to the next line of cover, the stone wall. This takes more time, but eventually the British are established here as well in the wood, and they're returning fire. The range to the Boers is now 200 yards, and after some time, the British launch a bayonet charge that clears them off the hilltop. This is where the Brits probably suffered the most casualties, not only because they are now charging magazine rifles at close range, but because the British artillery continues to flay the top of the hill with shrapnel, hitting many of their own charging infantry in the back. This is cleared up though, and the British take possession of the hilltop, mostly because the Boers have fallen back down the other side of the hill and are busily mounting the ponies they left at the base before riding off into the mist. In a second moment, the Royal Artillery would rather everyone forgot about, when a battery is moved onto the saddle between Talana Hill and Lennox Hill, where they can engage the retreating Boers. The battery's commanding officer refuses to fire, apparently because someone somewhere is waving a white flag around, and he's unsure whether the horsemen below him are Boers or the British cavalry that was sent around the back of the hill at the start of the battle. The absent British cavalry have in fact properly disappeared. They've bumped into superior Boer forces on their travels, been overwhelmed, and taken prisoner, though the British won't know about this for some time. In the end, the British have kicked the Boers off Talana Hill at the cost of 41 dead and 185 wounded, not counting the captured cavalry. Casualty figures for the Boers are basically guesswork, given that the Boers are not organised like a regular army and don't exactly keep count of these things, but everyone seems to agree that they were considerably less. The battle is usually touted as a tactical victory for the British, but one that comes at a high cost and carries no strategic benefit whatsoever. That said, a total of 226 casualties for 4,000 men attacking 3,000 set up in good defensive terrain doesn't seem over the top, especially when the battle is probably a lot more even than the numbers indicate, because the cavalry fails to perform and the attackers have left a quarter of their infantry and a third of their artillery back in camp. We've also got to take into account the broader strategic situation. Granted, it was the British's own fault that they were exposed to defeat in detail in this area of Natal, but that strategic problem translated into a subpar tactical situation. If Penn Symons had just been dealing with the 3,000 Boers sat on top of Talana Hill, and hadn't also had to deal with the prospect of greater enemy forces appearing halfway through the battle, he may well have come up with a plan that didn't involve charging straight up a slope into magazine rifle fire. As it was, he was apparently willing to risk sustaining higher casualties in return for a faster result and a shorter window of strategic vulnerability. Something else that tends to get glossed over is that the British were unable to capitalise on their success due to the issues with their artillery's sudden reluctance to open fire on the fleeing Boers and the cavalry's failure to get into position to pursue them. If either of these elements had come together, as they were intended to, then the Boers would probably have suffered much more heavily. The Boers themselves also missed substantial opportunities here. Symons was entirely correct to be worried about superior Boer forces in close proximity. There are another 4,000 on top of Mount Impati, only about 6 kilometres away from Talana Hill, and if they had gotten involved in the battle beyond chasing the British cavalry around, either by attacking the lightly defended camp down by Dundee or by attacking the flank of the infantry fight on Talana Hill, then the entire British brigade would have been in serious trouble. The next day, though, the Boers sit on top of Mount Impati and try and stage a repeat performance opening fire on the British camp from even further away using a Crusoe 155mm long tom that they've dragged up there. Symons' replacement, Brigadier General Ewell, does not take the bait, and after a few days the British evacuate the area in a night march, retreating back to Ladysmith. The day after Talana Hill we have our next battle. The lifeline of the British forces up at Dundee is the railway line, which runs down the spine of the triangle to Ladysmith. The Boers know this, and a 1,000-strong commando and the General Kock is taking up positions on the hills of Elandslaagte, where they can cut the line. The British, under General Sir John French, bring 3,500 men up the railway to kick the Boers off and secure their line of communication. There are some obvious similarities between this battle and Talana Hill. The British have 3 infantry battalions again, with artillery and cavalry support, and the Boers have taken up another strategically offensive but tactically defensive position. Here, however, the British don't only outnumber the Boers by a more significant margin, but they're not plagued by strategic anxieties. They've had forces up here since the morning, visibility is good, and they know that these Boers are on their own, so they don't need to rush, and they don't need to worry about other enemy forces popping up unexpectedly. The infantry brigade commander, Sir Ian Hamilton, throws 1 battalion forward to pin the Boers in place, and sends his other 2 battalions, along with some local irregulars, around the right flank of the hill mass. The Royal Artillery has already achieved fire superiority over the few Boer guns that are there, and the cavalry are waiting off on the far flanks, where they can watch the infantry assault and commit themselves once they've deemed it successful. Hamilton has his infantry advance in very open order, and despite the veldt being entirely bare here, there is plenty of dead ground on the approaches. We also get a good idea of exactly how one of the battalions, at least, the 1st Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment, are working at the tactical level, because some war correspondents have come up from Ladysmith to watch the battle. The Devons are the holding battalion attacking in the centre, and they are attacking forward in extended line, controlled by their company commanders, alternately firing volleys and dashing forwards. Once they're close enough that the Boers' fire forces them to go to ground, the Devons stop, the order goes out to fire independently. The firing line is steadily reinforced as the reserve companies are fed in, and they wait for the flanking attack to develop. This takes some time to come online, but a lot of the same features persist. The British infantry are well spread out, they are making use of dead ground and the terrain to advance, and with the time having gotten to evening and the distant thunderstorm darkening the sky, they are making difficult targets in their khaki uniforms. The flank attack goes in just as the storm breaks, and on hearing it, the Devons renew their advance too. The ridge top is a jumble of rocks, open grass and barbed wire fences, and the British infantry attack across it under fire from the Boers, who, for the most part, they never see through the driving rain. Whenever the front attacking line stalls, it's reinforced by troops from the reserve lines following behind, and as time goes on, just like at Talana Hill, the battalions become mixed up and command and control degenerates to increasingly low levels. But eventually, the Brits storm the main Boer positions. Once they're up there, there is a short outbreak of total chaos, due mostly to the loosely controlled nature of the Boer commando. Some small groups of Boers are fleeing, others are trying to surrender, and at least one party, personally led by General Kock, mounts a counterattack. This is quickly put down, but not without inflicting more casualties. The infantry are now in possession of the ridgeline, and those Boers who haven't already fled and aren't dead, wounded or captured are streaming down the rear slope back to their ponies so they can escape. Then the British cavalry smashes in. Having seen the success of the infantry assault, they've been unleashed, riding around the side of the hill and apparently catching the Boers unaware. The British cavalry here are the 21st Lancers and the 5th Dragoon Guards, and they charge in with sabres, pistols and lances. It's not clear whether the Boers were simply not paying attention as they focused on getting away, or whether the British cavalry managed to use the terrain to surprise them, but they mount a successful shock cavalry charge against an enemy armed with magazine-fed bolt-action rifles. and not only break them, but ride them down and relentlessly prosecute the pursuit, despite many of the Boers throwing down their weapons and trying to surrender. At the end of the day, the Boers have lost roughly 46 dead, 105 wounded and 181 missing, though as with all the Boer figures these are probably not the whole story, and the British have lost 55 dead and 205 wounded, in exchange for booting a small commando off a hill and securing their railway route up to Dundee. The British casualty figures are interesting because, on the face of it, they should really be less than the casualty figures at Talana Hill. Here, the British mount a flank attack instead of a frontal assault. They have the advantage of being able to take their time, they outnumbered the enemy by a more significant margin, and they are attacking in diminishing light, including, during the actual assault, a downpour that severely limits visibility. Yet they've actually suffered more casualties than Penn Symons' force at Talana Hill, 260 compared to 226. So all those factors apparently made little to no difference. And this makes sense. Developments in infantry firepower are going to have a much more significant impact down at the minor tactical and individual level, where, despite different circumstances, the infantry's experience of both battles was almost identical. Down at this level, they were fighting through frontal assaults on enemy positions. At Talana Hill this is pretty obvious, but while the overall scheme of the battle at Elandslaagte involved a flanking attack, down in the detail, this still translated into uphill frontal assaults against Boer riflemen hiding in the rocks, whether the Boer position as a whole was being attacked from the side or from the front. In both battles, the British infantry attacked in open order in the classic European fashion for the times, a forward line of infantry which advances to and makes contact with the enemy, and then, if necessary, is reinforced by successive lines following in reserve until it gains the momentum and firepower needed to resume the advance. And this works. In both cases, the British infantry successfully attacked the enemy and kicked them out of strong defensive terrain. Probably the biggest takeaway is that with these spread out lines and the increasing loss of control and mixing up of units as the lines advance, merge together and are broken up by the terrain and effects of enemy fire, we can see command and control spiraling down until it rests on small groups of soldiers or even individuals. The response to this is to filter responsibility and tactical decision making down to ever smaller units. This requires a lot of cultural change in most European armies and, probably more importantly, requires changes in how small unit leaders are trained and educated. First, junior officers and then NCOs have to make the jump from relaying the orders of their superiors to coming up with their own and acting with increased tactical independence. It's worth quoting a short passage from the defence of Duffer's Drift, where a British junior officer is dropped off to defend the small ford because it sums up the problem pretty well. If they had given me a job like fighting the Battle of Waterloo, or Sedan, or Bull Run, I knew all about that. I also knew how to take up a position for a division or even an army corps, but the stupid little subaltern's game of the defence of a drift with a small detachment was, curiously enough, most perplexing. I'd never really considered such a thing. Further down the scale, something the Boer War as a whole demonstrates to the British is that they need to change how they train their soldiers, and very specifically, how they train their soldiers to shoot. The Boers are generally much better shots than their imperial opponents. They do a lot of hunting, and in particular, they are much better at snap shooting. It's one thing to hit the bullseye on a stationary range target, it's quite another to hit a head-sized target popping out from behind a random rock for a few seconds before it disappears. The Boers have an advantage in both battles because they're on the tactical defensive, and better able to profit from cover and concealment up on the hilltops, but given the post-war emphasis the British put on snap shooting, one of the key factors in these battles could simply be that the British are not very good at engaging fleeting pop-up targets, and most of the fire they put out is simply ineffective. This would particularly be the case earlier on, when the British companies are still under tight control, volley firing their way forward. it's not difficult to see how something as rigid as volley firing would be somewhat inappropriate against enemy troops who aren't obliging enough to stand around waiting to get shot, whether this is as suppressive fire as part of the Brits' fire of movement or actual destructive fire. But effective snap shooting goes hand in hand with decentralization too. It's just one of a long list of new skills that soldiers are going to have to pick up. Target identification, range estimation, the selection of firing positions, the use of ground to advance with minimal exposure. These are all skills that are currently performed by the officers and need to dribble down to lower levels and the individual soldier before the tactical problems thrown up by the increase in infantry firepower can be solved. And the British Army in 1899 is a long way away from this. But what about the Boers? Their forces are already much more decentralised than any European army is ever going to get, to the point that this actually causes them serious problems, like for example General Koch taking 1,000 men off the Elandslaagte and getting crushed by superior British forces. And although the Boer riflemen are demonstrating much better individual skills than the British, this isn't enough to achieve their strategic objectives. The battles of Talana Hill and Elandslaagte are the two only real victories that the British secure in the early stages of the war. Soon, the British force in Natal is trapped in Ladysmith under siege by the Boers, like the other isolated forces at Kimberley and Mafeking. But instead of these defeats knocking the enthusiasm out of the British public, they've just made them mad, and 1,000 more troops are on the way. The Boers settle in to receive them, and they've learnt and confirmed some important lessons. The first is that the tactical defensive has a significant advantage over the tactical offensive, and that their overall strategy of taking up positions the British can't ignore and forcing them to attack is the best chance they have of giving their enemy a bloody nose. The second is that the British massively outclassed them in the effectiveness of their artillery, and this is going to drive the approach they take to the upcoming defensive battles in the next phase of the war, which we're going to take a look at in the next episode of the War Room. Hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in the next video.